Well, good evening and welcome to the broadcast tonight. And I want to thank you all for, at least those of you who've written in with some questions and emails. I always get lots of emails. I like to remind everyone now and then that, the shorter the question is, the easier it is for me to respond to on air, and the more likely that I will actually respond to it. A page-long question is really hard for me to respond to during this program. So if you have something you want me to talk about or you want me to respond to, the briefer you can be, the better. And yet, one of the nice things about getting the emails is it really shows me where people are at, what their concerns are, what they're dealing with. Because I always figure that one of the things that's really important about any spiritual teaching is its relevance, to one's everyday life. And that's a really important thing. It has to be relevant. And I think also not only does the teaching have to feel relevant, but also the way that we approach it has to feel relevant to our lives. By that I mean the sort of attitude that we engage with it in. There's lots of different ways, say, to engage with the spiritual teaching. We can come at it with lots of different agendas, you might say. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I just mean that in the sense of we approach a spiritual teaching hoping that we'll get certain things out of it, or hoping that it will help us or provide some guidance as in regards to our real deep inner calling in our life. And to me, that's really the heart of what spirituality is. It's a way of responding, actually. It's a way of responding to the deepest calling that you have in your life, your existential calling, which really simply means, again, the thing that really hits you at a really deep level, what you feel drawn to or compelled by, because sometimes we can feel compelled by a deep sort of spiritual instinct, or an instinct towards wholeness, by whatever mean you give the word wholeness. I mean, you can use lots of words for that, God and unity and love, lots of different expressions for wholeness. Of course, we can be compelled towards truth or reality. We can be compelled away from unnecessary suffering or unnecessary sorrow. And these are really the deep sort of existential calls, and they're actually quite universal. They transcend cultural boundaries. They transcend geographic boundaries. They transcend personality differences. The way that our own calling may inform us, or the way that we might receive it and approach it, can differ from person to person. But the sort of origination point of our deepest calling or our deepest yearning is really quite universal. And I think there's a important thing to understand, really, about spirituality, and it's something that sometimes I think we don't really reflect upon. And it's actually a really simple thing. And it starts with even with the word spirituality. Spirituality, it's at least in the modern day, it's almost one of those catch-all words, it's almost as if sometimes it seems to me spirituality means almost, whatever people want it to mean. It's become such a catch-all phrase. And of course, there can be associated with all sorts of sort of imagination and all sorts of things. But when you get right down to, I think, what spirituality really is in its really authentic form, or forms, because it can take many different forms, but spirituality is really the calling from something very, very deep within us. It's a calling from part of our being, or the greater part of our being, which is actually trying to find its way through all the intricate layers of complication that the sort of egoic mind seems to be constantly creating. And one of the challenges of spirituality is to kind of keep connected with the root of it, with its point of origination inside of you. The reason that becomes so important is so that the spiritual impulse itself doesn't get sort of hijacked by all the agendas of sort of the conflicted self, really, which often reaches out for quick answers and temporary fixes and temporary satisfactions, and often just kind of skims upon the surface of our experience. You know, the conflicted self is really, even though it can feel like it has very deep roots sometimes within you, it actually is a very surface part of our experience. It's a particularly compelling part of experience because it's so, you know, the more confused something is, the more divided it is, the more compelling it is. It almost has a sort of psychological gravitational force to it. Conflict and certainly our sort of personal dramas, you know, they have this sort of gravitational force which keeps just pulling attention in almost a very impersonal way, in the same way that the gravity that holds all of our bodies to the earth is an impersonal force. And the conflicted self is it produces so much angst in all these various forms, and this whole world of angst that it creates is very sort of dramatic, you know, and has a very dense kind of gravitational pull. And that's one of the things that anybody is actually, in a certain sense, competing with for attention. Because our attention is really our most prized commodity that we have. It's the most important aspect of us is our attention, and what we're doing with our attention and where we're putting our attention. And in spirituality, in one manner of speaking, is the act or a kind of conscious use of our attention, a conscious use of our consciousness, a conscious use of our awareness. In other words, what are we doing with this most basic and most fundamental aspect of our being, which is our awareness, our consciousness? What are we doing with it? Where are we putting it? Where is it abiding? Where is our intention around our attention? And this is really, in many ways, this is the heart of many spiritual practices. It's kind of, what am I doing with my consciousness? What am I doing with my awareness? What am I doing with my attention? Is it something that so often people don't even think about? They don't even consider. It's part of the density of the gravitational force of the conflicted self or the false self. It's sort of this dense gravitational force to where, you know, you can go through all of life simply trying to solve one internal state of sorrow, one disaster after another, and it just seems to never end. In fact, if our attention remains captive to that dimension of experience, then it is endless. It's endless because it's cyclic. You deal with one thing only to deal with the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and it just has this sort of cyclic, endless nature. I suppose that's why the Buddha referred to it as the wheel of samsara, this sort of cyclic turning of a wheel. It doesn't really have it's not a straight line. It doesn't actually arrive at a destination. The wheel of samsara, the wheel of, which is really the wheel of a kind of needless suffering. That if our attention is held captive by this cyclic movement of internal conflict, it remains held captive, and the cyclic nature of it just keeps going, and it goes and goes and goes and goes and goes. Often, not always, but often people kind of come to a real authentic spirituality when, they may have worked on themselves for a long period of time or a short period of time, and they start to get on to the fact that even though a kind of working on oneself can be a perfectly legitimate and at times very necessary thing to do, that if our attention stays solely within that domain, then there's always the next thing, and there's always the next thing, and in other words, we're always working and working and working and working and working on arriving somewhere all the time, supposing that if we work on ourselves enough, we'll get to this place where we won't have to work on ourselves anymore. And a lot of times people that have done a lot of that work, a lot of times their real deep spiritual life starts when they worked on themselves to a certain extent, and they start to see the cyclic nature of it. Although it can have some important effects. In other words, it can relieve a certain amount of sorrow and angst and suffering, but there always seems to be sort of the next layer and 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 the next layer. And so even though that kind of work can be very important at a certain point, if we have all of our attention occupied in that domain of human existence, then it very much we start to realize at a certain point that it's cyclic. It just kind of keeps going. There's always the next thing about oneself to improve upon. And so there's sort of this point of balance in a manner of speaking. But before I get to that, I'll just mention that when we start to realize this sort of cyclic nature, just the recognition of it, having lived through it enough, the recognition of it can start to free up attention. When we start to wonder, is there something more than this endless project, than turning myself into an endless project, into an endless project of improvement? As I said, the balance point, in a sense, is even though that can be important and provide a usefulness in life to a certain point, they're also simultaneously comes with it a kind of recognition that it does have a quality to it that's endless. There does have a quality to it that has a sort of familiar, repetitive feeling to it. And that's when consciousness, that's when our attention starts to become available to something else. That's when our attention becomes available to dive into something inside of ourselves that's much deeper than all that. The danger of doing that is that the divided mind can utilize the deeper, turning attention inward in a deeper way. It can utilize even that as a means of simply avoiding oneself, as a means of sort of constantly distracting oneself from their own shortcomings. But nonetheless, everything has its dangers, has its potential uses and its potential drawbacks. But the spirituality really starts to become meaningful and starts to come alive when we start to look in a deeper way, that we really start to look and get interested at the actual roots of suffering, the roots of not only suffering but confusion, the roots of our perception of separation, whether that's from life or from God or from just about anything for that matter. But when we really start to get interested in the sort of fundamental root of sorrow, the fundamental roots of misperception, and this is really where the spiritual impulse starts to take life. It starts to really, come forward. And of course, as human beings in the relative world, we're all of this. We can't segment ourselves off and say, well, I'm just going to be the spiritual part, and I'm not going to be this more surface personality aspect. You can't. A lot of people try to do that, and they're ultimately unsuccessful at it because we have to take ourselves as a whole, as a complete and whole being, and everything that means. So spirituality in its true sense is diving to the very core of the whole entire being, the whole entire human being, to really start to get to the core of who we are, what the cause of unnecessary suffering is, what the cause of alienation is, the cause of the sense of isolation or separation. These sort of deep issues. These deep issues actually transcend our own personal history. Of course, our personal history interacts with these issues, of course. We can't separate them out, really. But they really do transcend our own personal life. By that I mean our personal history, our life story, what we've experienced, what we've gone through up to this point in time. These deeper issues are more fundamental than whatever our personal history has been or our personal story has been. They're sort of innate in large part to the human experience. And so when we're really endeavoring to encounter them at their core level, at the root level, this is really when we're connecting deeply with the spiritual impulse. And there's also a very positive side to that impulse too, because it is the impulse to connect, to have a deeply meaningful experience of being, of existing. And by meaningful, I don't necessarily mean that we could come up with a intellectual or philosophical meaning, like this is the meaning of my existence. I don't mean that, because that's ultimately whatever we might think the meaning of our life is. It's in the end of the day, it's an abstraction. It's a decision in our mind that we may make, which is real meaning is much deeper than that. The real meaning is actually the experience of the tremendous beauty and significance and profoundness of being. of what it is to deeply be. And so that's part of the spiritual impulse too, as is the impulse towards a kind of connection. Because it seems to me that most human beings at various levels feel a kind of disconnection. They feel disconnected to themselves. It's sort of ironic that, or contradictory or paradoxical, that one can feel disconnected from themselves and at the same time completely lost in their sort of personal difficulty, whatever that might be. And you can actually have both of these experiences simultaneously, almost like being lost in yourself and simultaneously feeling very disconnected from yourself at a very deep level. Or certainly a sort of disconnection from the world around you. Just disconnected from the world. Part of the dawning of self-consciousness is the dawning of the experience of disconnection. And the spiritual impulse is actually an impulse for a very deep kind of reconnection, deeper than the connection with other people or friends or lovers or all of that, even though that's a important part of the human experience as well. But the spiritual connection goes to something really deeper. It's a kind of a connection with all of life, with the whole of existence. We could call that God, or the whole of existence, or we could call it whatever we want. But it's really the impulse of a kind of deep connection. And by connection, I mean one of my favorite ways that I've heard the experience of profound unity expressed was by a Zen master called Dogen. And Dogen, his description of unity was an absolute intimacy with the 10,000 things. And the 10,000 things here, of course, refers to all things, all things that we can see or perceive in any way. It's the experience of a profound intimacy, an intimacy to the point of non-separation, an intimacy to the point of identity, in fact. By that I mean an intimacy to the point where there's no relationship in a certain sense. There's no two-ness. There's this profound intimacy and closeness. And if you really ever look at any experience of deep intimacy, even intimacy between two human beings, even at that level, when that experience of intimacy gets very deep and very profound, it starts to blur the lines of separation. And there's an instinct within human beings to experience that, It's as has been said before, it's sort of the urge to merge, the urge to merge together. But of course, in its deepest spiritual sense, it's going beyond even the experience of merging, because merging is based and predicated upon the experience of separation. You have to have at least the experience of two separate things coming together to have the experience of merging, and that's why when human beings do merge, then they eventually kind of unmerge, but then they want to remerge, and so it goes. That becomes sort of the rhythm of a lot of human relationship, and yet in its deepest sense, this instinct towards intimacy goes beyond merging. It's not fully satisfied until it goes to the point of this sort of profound intimacy, an intimacy where there's really isn't two distinct things being experienced. And so, however we might language that in ourselves, like I said, what I'm talking about could be languaged as the intimacy with the 10,000 things. It could be called unity. It could be called union with God. There's lots of ways of expressing it and different sort of ways that people hold it within themselves and express it. But these are also part of the positive yearning of the spiritual impulse. And so I think it's important to kind of understand that, because it's sort of this balance between there is a balance between being very open and available to, there is a place for sort of one's personal work on themselves, or sort of personal psychology. There's a very important place for that in one's life. Anybody that just tries to skip over that and think that just the spiritual impulse is going to answer everything are usually in the end quite disappointed by what they find, because they're not encountering themselves as a whole being. Having said that, it's also important to realize and to really have a deep feeling for that this impulse towards truth or God or wholeness or intimacy is something that goes right down to the very roots of our being, and it transcends our personal history, it transcends our personal psychology. That spirituality in many senses is about dealing with it and encountering this impulse at its deepest and most fundamental, in the most deepest and fundamental way, in its deepest and most fundamental expression. And that's for a certain period of time, that's a challenge, because you have the sort of more conflicted elements of the personality tend to have this great gravitational pull. As you've probably noticed, human drama has a gravitational pull to it. It's sticky. And in that sense, it's, at least from the ego's point of view, it's compelling, so there's sort of this love-hate relationship with it. If you watch the average TV show, the average series that runs on TV, most generally you have a heavy element of this sort of sticky human drama to keep it compelling, to keep it interesting. And it's part of that stickiness, the gravitational pull that literally pulls people's attention into it. Will it get resolved and what will happen? And, it's very, very, has this sort of gravitational or compelling nature to it. And the spiritual impulse, this is what it's contending with. Because at its deepest place, the impulse itself is far more subtle, I guess you could say, even though you can experience it in a very visceral way. But in its deepest sense, this impulse is, it's like a candle flame. One can easily be distracted from it, and one can easily confuse the spiritual impulse with the agendas of the ego. It's not always as clear as one might imagine. And this is why the importance of ability to kind of be quiet. Because when we're being quiet, being quiet is actually a kind of deep state of listening. If you listen really deeply, just the act of listening itself evokes a state of inner quiet.